Thank you, Mr. Amin, and thanks for everyone and participants. In my name and the name of the European Saudi Organization, we thank you for your time, for your efforts, and sharing your expertise. I will try today to speak very briefly about how Saudi Arabia is using its own mechanisms in the United Nations to whitewash its image and cover up its violations and justify them. Upon our expertise, I will try to highlight how the Saudi government uses such mechanisms. After having neglected these mechanisms, we have noticed that the Saudi Arabia has changed the way it deals with these mechanisms. It started to using them and promoting its image and whitewashing. This came along with increasing numbers of arbitrary acts and with the various mechanisms of United Nations to improve the human rights. The Saudi Arabia have used these mechanisms in a manipulative way. I will try to highlight this very briefly and speak about these mechanisms and how they've been used by Saudi Arabia. First of all, through the correspondence and the special rapporteurs. During the recent years, Saudi Arabia has changed the way it deals with these special messages or recommendations sent to them by the rapporteurs, which are complaints related to victims of violations. And instead of neglecting these messages completely, it started responding back to these messages within the specified duration. It's trying through these responses to appear as if it's cooperating and to justify these violations. But the way we read these responses, that Saudi Arabia is only neglecting and saying we are not violating, we are only applying the laws to protect the individuals. The complaints and also some of these information. There are complaints which include torture, mistreatment, and Saudi Arabia only neglects that they didn't do this. The responses actually is a proof that there is no serious investigation on this. And therefore, most of the responses of Saudi Arabia, it claims that it's actually being or interacting with these messages. However, this is the total contrary. And the works teaming and the human rights groups, they actually issue some reports on some issues which has to do with human rights. In some of the cases, Saudi Arabia has dealt with some cases with executions, and they have said, these working teams have said that Saudi Arabia has actually violated the human rights. Second of all, there's how the Saudi Arabia deals with the international conventions. The Saudi Arabia has ratified 7 international conventions out of 14, which are related to human rights, general human rights, like the civil, the political, the economic, the social, the cultural. And it forbids the states usually to deal in such a way, like to clarify the idea. States are prevented from using the torture or the random detention or the execution outside the judicial procedures. And all of these states must amend their laws, amend their practices in a way that guarantee these rights stated in the agreements. Also, Saudi Arabia always in the public platforms, they try to say that they are a state which have ratified these agreements and they abide to all the articles. And they actually use this claim to state that they didn't do any violations. However, ratifying these conventions doesn't prove that they actually are abiding by them. For instance, Saudi Arabia is a member state in the torture abolition agreement since 1997. However, and despite documenting the torture, which has been using in a very broadly in Saudi Arabia. Also, Saudi Arabia is a member state in the Children Rights Agreement, and it it confirms the right to children and life and safety. However, Saudi Arabia, during the 7 last years, they have executed 12 children and many others are threatened. And also within the mechanisms and the important mechanisms of United Nations is the independent expertise visit to the states in order to increase the awareness national-wise, international-wise, especially around human rights and presenting all the ways contributing to support and promoting the United Nations work teams. However, Saudi Arabia is ignoring all the or most of the visits which are sent by the special rapporteurs. Recent-wise, also it has ignored one of the visits which has been reminded by the Saudi Arabia for 16 years. And also they reminded that they are invited to have this visit in Saudi Arabia. However, Saudi Arabia for now hasn't accepted this. However, in 2017, Saudi Arabia has accepted 2 visits application to each of the special rapporteur, and the public media in Saudi Arabia have promoted that these visits are a solid proof that Saudi Arabia is open to development in human rights. However, after the recommendations were sent by the special rapporteur, they have ignored them and they have prosecuted individuals who have communicated with the special rapporteur, including Isan Nukhaifi, who is a human rights activist and who is still detained, despite that his judgment period has ended. In addition to this, Saudi Arabia uses the continuous sessions of the Human Rights Council. Saudi Arabia in recent years have participated in these human rights, which are periodically held to discuss the human rights around the world, which are supposed to change, and it's supposed to be participated by the different member states and the different states around the world. Saudi Arabia would speak about its accomplishments in the human rights sector. For example, the Saudi newspapers have circulated a declaration for one of the Saudi Arabia Minister of Foreign Affairs that they have done exceptional developments, especially in human rights, especially in the rights of women and children. In the same speech, Saudi Arabia, and at the same time of this speech, Saudi Arabia detained tens of activists, women activists for human rights, and tortured them, including also minors. So where are all of these speeches prove that they are not a solid proof of what they're claiming? In addition to that, Saudi Arabia has used also human women figures and youth figures, that this is actually a solid proof also of them treating and developing the women rights. However, meanwhile, the torture, the violence against women is actually increasing, especially the women activists. And the last participation for one of the activists who was Samar Badawi, who was banned from traveling. Also, Saudi Arabia is taking advantage of this council to attack or to respond back to any state which criticize their practices. So we call for the United Nations to improve their practices on how to deal and how to apply these mechanisms, especially that those countries who ratify these conventions aren't actually going by them or abiding to them. Saudi Arabia isn't just attacking the states which are criticizing them, but they are preventing any other one to actually apply or abide to these mechanisms. And they would actually, Saudi Arabia was once placed on the blacklist for the children rights violations due to the war on or against Yemen. And I would like to conclude here. And despite all of this money that's being spent, all of these stories being narrated by the Saudi government, And despite that, it has silenced a lot of activists inside Saudi Arabia. The criticisms are actually increasing against the violations of Saudi Arabia, especially from the Commissioner of United Nations, the special reporters, whether they were public violations or silenced violations. And this proves that we should work through the Human Rights Council mechanisms of United Nations to actually come up with those facts and narrate the stories of the victims, which the Saudi Arabia is trying to cover up. And thank you.